this came together from a tweet. So I read the book I read The School for Good Mothers about a year ago, and I tweeted about it and said something about how if this seemed like horror to you, wait till you learn about the real child welfare system. And Jasmine responded, and Dorothy is I'm a long-time stan of Dorothy's. I think she's amazing and has done incredible work on abolition of the family policing system. And so we really wanted to bring the two of them together today to talk about a little bit about the overlap between the books and to really start a conversation around how we can use storytelling as advocacy. So with that, I'm going to invite them to join me today. Spend too much time doing introductions, so I just want to note that this was Jasmine's debut novel, and it was met with a lot of critical acclaim, including by our former president, Barack Obama.
Our forever president.
Our forever president. And as I mentioned, Dorothy is both a legal scholar and a professor of sociology and law at University of Pennsylvania and a Juvenile Law Center board member. And this is her fourth book, I believe. And I read Shattered Bonds. I read it while I was in law school, so I am truly a long-term fan.
Thank you.
So with that, I mentioned that the title of our event today is Art as Advocacy, and so I wanted to talk a little bit first about the storytelling that is in both of your books. And so Dorothy, you started your book with a really harrowing tale of Vanessa, and you told a story about how her children were taken from her. So why was it important for you to include these stories and how you wove those stories into the text of your nonfiction book, weaving these stories into the text, and that's something I know that you've done in previous books as well.
Yeah, and thank you for the introduction. Thank you to University of the Arts and, of course, my dear Juvenile Law Center and everyone involved in bringing us together. This is such a treat and an honor to be able to discuss this family policing in fiction and nonfiction with the wonderful Jessamine Chan. So it's really an honor to be here. There were a few reasons why I tell stories about mostly Black mothers who have been impacted by the family policing system, and why I include stories in everything I write. One, because that's how I know about the system. I wouldn't understand the horrors of the system. I wouldn't understand it as a terrorizing system. I might believe the propaganda that the system has out there, that it's a benevolent system, if I didn't come to know mothers who had their children taken from them. That was an essential part of my education about the system. I hadn't experienced it myself. And I really give full credit to these mothers for teaching me about how the system operates and the harms that it inflicts on families. And so part of it is to honor them and their experiences. If I left it out, I would be leaving out a really key element of my own understanding of the system. And then another reason is in order to help other people understand what it's like to experience the system. Even though it affects thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of families in the United States, it's still the case that most people only know about it through the media, which has a very one-sided view, portrayal of why people get involved in the child welfare system, family policing system. And there is this idea that it is saving children, that it's benevolent, that it's helping families, that it's protecting children. Even the words, the child protection and foster care and child welfare. So people think that's true if they haven't experienced it themselves. And if you just tell them it's not true, they may think you're making it up. And if you tell the stories of people who have been harmed by this system, I think it helps people understand better how it actually operates. And it also, I hope, makes people more interested in learning more empathetic and caring about what's going on. And so those are some of the reasons I tell stories, true stories, about mothers who have been sucked into the system and harmed so desperately by it.
Thank you. And Jasmine, you talked about how one of the things that kind of inspired you to write about a family and a mother who lost her child to Child Protective Services was a story that you read, a true story that you read. So I know you didn't set out to be an advocate when you were writing your book, but how do you see the work of your book really bringing to light some of these social issues and creating a forum for questioning the validity of these state systems?
First, I just want to say thank you so much to Riya and Stephen and Janine for this huge opportunity. It's really rare for novelists to get to appear at events with scholars, so it's such an honor to share the stage with Dr. Roberts, and thank you for receiving all my fangirl battling leading up to this event. So I don't think I set out to be an advocate because I didn't dare presume that I would be able to do that, but I mean, I think I did want people to learn more, about the issues that I was writing about. I mean, when I think back to when I started the book in 2014, now that I look back on it, it was kind of a crazy thing to do because I don't have any personal experience with the family court system, and I could only approach it from a position of empathy and curiosity. And I think what the New Yorker piece that you mentioned, so The School for Mothers is about a Chinese-American single mom named Frida Liu who loses custody of her toddler daughter after having one very bad day. So there are many parallels to the real-life family court system, but it is a dystopian novel, so there's also a lot of sci-fi and speculative twists, which I think I did partly to give me permission to write about the subject, because I think if I'd approached the topic from a purely realist stance, I think I would have spent the whole time worried that I wasn't getting it right. And I think using speculative elements gave me a little bit more room to play to get ideas across with a little bit more creative license. But I think the New Yorker piece that you mentioned is called Where Is Your Mother by the journalist Rachel Aviv, which appeared in late 2013. And that story is about a single mom who left her toddler son at home for a stretch of time. The neighbors heard the baby crying and called the police, and after that day she never got him back. And I didn't sit down with that story and think, well, this will be the beginning of my first novel. It was more that the article planted a kernel of rage in my mind. And it made me want to learn more about the subject, and also made me wonder why are we talking about this every day? Because it seems like there is no greater horror to have the government take your children away, but it doesn't seem to make front page news all that often.
So you, in your book, Jasmine, you make a point to articulate how Frida's experience through the system differs because she's Chinese American, and how her experiences also differ from her Black and brown peers. And Dorothy's work has focused on separation of Black families, you know, since the beginning. So I wonder if you can both talk a little bit about how race played an important role in the story that you created and the systems and that you've written about.
So first I just have to say in response to Jasmine's comments about not really knowing that much about the child welfare system and writing a fictional book, that the book is so accurate about what happens to mothers in the child welfare system. And as I was reading it, I kept thinking, how does she know so much about the system? Every aspect of it is so on point to the way in which mothers are treated. And even that line, and I'm sorry if I'm skipping too far ahead, but even the line, I am a bad mother, but I'm learning to be a good mother, and we're going to fix you to make you a good mother, and blaming mothers for any harm that happens to their child, it's because there's something pathological about them that needs to be fixed by the system. Well, that is exactly the ideology of the child welfare system. That's what family policing is all about. And even the details about the home visits and the supervised visits and the surveillance and the way caseworkers talk to the mothers and the way they're told, be careful, if you do anything wrong, you might lose your child. Every part of it is so on point. It's just amazing. Yes, and race, of course, is just an integral aspect. Race and racism. I could go on forever about that, but the child welfare system is grounded in not only that ideology of blaming mothers for any harms to children. Of course, most of the harms are caused by social inequities, structures in our society that make it difficult to be a mother. And instead of correcting, changing, radically transforming those structures, mothers get blamed for it. But racism is absolutely essential to that because Black mothers in particular are blamed as innately bad mothers. They cannot be fixed. And this is why the child welfare system continues generation after generation after generation, because in the US, the formal child welfare system, especially since the 1960s, when foster care, taking children away, became the main service, so-called service that it provides. And from that point on, Black children have been disproportionately involved. When I first started working on this issue in the late 1980s into the 1990s, Black children were the largest group of children in foster care. The largest group, 4 times as likely as white children to be taken from their families. And so the ideology of the bad mother is so entangled with deeply embedded stereotypes about Black mothers who innately are bad mothers, who cannot be redeemed, where their children are better off anywhere except for in their care. This has been shown by interviews, by studies, by the experiences of Black mothers in the system to be the case. And so you really can't understand why this system is so accepted if you don't understand the racism in it. And also, just historically, we can trace this kind of punitive approach to families and the way in which our society accepts family separation routinely. Now, this routinely happens in Black neighborhoods. Can be traced back to slavery and the separation of families that was absolutely essential to the institution of slavery, to the breakup of families through the child apprenticeship system, and then the ignoring of Black families for much of the 20th century. And then as Black families began to be taken in by the welfare system, this shift to aggressive family separation and foster care being where most of the money in the system is spent. 10 times as much money, federal money, is spent on maintaining children away from their families as it is on providing services to families. So racism, white supremacy, white saviorism is an essential part of family policing. You cannot explain it without taking that into account.
First, I want to say thank you for your kind words and thumbs up from you. It was like the best thumbs up of all. But the way race plays in my book, so Frida is the only Asian in the school, and I did think about the fact that there would be problems and blind spots having a book about the family court system also be narrated by, or having the point of view be an Asian American point of view, because in real life, no one would be watching her in terms of her, because of her race and class. Like the neighbors probably wouldn't call. I mean, depends. The neighbors might call, but I mean, she wouldn't be caught in the dragnet of the family court system in real life. But I knew that no matter how much research I didn't feel that I could represent a Black woman's experience authentically on the page. And so I thought I would tell the story from an Asian American perspective, and also be able to see like the racial dynamics of the school in that way, because Asians occupy such a strange place in American culture, and it's both like hyper visible and invisible at the same time. So I wanted to write about that uncomfortable, isolated space. But I also wanted the demographics of the school to reflect the real life demographics, which is that it's, as shown in Dr. Roberts' work and the work of your organization, that it disproportionately affects Black and brown women who are poor. So I did want to build that into the school itself and to have that reflected.
Dorothy, you touched a little bit on my next point when you were talking about kind of how, there's so much about judgment of motherhood generally that traces back over 400 years within our family policing system. And then in your book also, Jasmine, there's so much of like this cultural and state-imposed judgment of mothers. And so, in addition to all the things that you heard about us at the outset, all three of us also are mothers. And I think that the perspective of what makes a good mother looks very different from personal perspectives, from cultural perspectives, and from the state-imposed perspective. And I'm wondering if you could both talk a little bit about kind of the tension between those two, and how you use that in the way that you approach your work.
Yes, so one aspect of Jasmine's book that is reflected in the real family policing system is the way in which mothers are presumed to be bad mothers. You're presumed to, if any harm happened or suspected to happen or thought that it might happen to your child, and you live in a particular neighborhood. So I'm glad that Jasmine pointed out, really the protagonist of your book probably would never have gotten involved in the system. But mothers in impoverished neighborhoods who leave their children at home alone so they can apply for a job or just go get food from the grocery store, they are seriously at risk of having their children taken from them. And so there is that reality in your book, which is reflected in the real life family policing system. And if you're accused, which could be from an anonymous hotline, child abuse hotline call, it could be from a police report, it could be from a teacher, it could be from a doctor, it could be from a social worker, it could be from a neighbor, it could be from a family member. Anyone can report you. And if you're accused, you are presumed to be a bad mother. And then you have to prove yourself in order to keep your children or get them back. And so, what makes a good mother, in a way, and I'm kind of approaching your question maybe from a different angle, because in a way, it's not really about whether you're a good or bad mother. You are a bad mother if you get accused of being one. And the caseworkers are going to come into your home not to see if you're a good mother. They're going to look for evidence to support their view that you're a bad mother. When they come in homes and they inspect every corner, they open cabinets, they look under beds, they look in the corners, they look in dresser drawers, they look in the refrigerator, they interrogate your children, they interrogate you. Do you think they're going in there to find the good things about you? I know they're going in there to prove that you really are a bad mother, even if the accusation is different from what they find in the house. The accusation might have been you left your child at home, but they're going to be looking for drugs. They're going to be looking for evidence that you don't feed your children. They're going to be looking for evidence of a dirty house. You know, a messy home is even a term that sometimes they use against mothers. They're going to be looking for, you know, are you depressed or are you too happy? I interviewed or spoke with a mother. She let me see her files, and the counselor, the psychotherapist, which is another common truth from your book, the way in which psychologists are used to find evidence against the mothers, which is the most unethical thing you can imagine, along with all the other unethical things. But she was dinged for being too happy when her children were taken from her. Then others are, you're too angry because your children were taken from you, or you aren't taking enough accountability. So it's that you are bad and we're going to try to reform you into some standard that is really hard to grasp. It's really whatever the service plan says you have to do, that's what you have to do. And you know, one thing that's at the very end of your book, Jessamine, the judge says, I think we've learned something about you. And Frida thinks, yeah, they had cameras in my house, they interrogated me, they sent me to psychotherapists, they looked at how I treated my child under supervised visits, they spied on me, they did all these things, and yet they don't really know who I am as a mother. Because that's not important. It's really just a policing system to police mothers. It's not really about trying to make anyone a good mother. It's punishing people who are presumed to be bad mothers. That's what it's about.
Well, this reminds me, one of the things that drew me to the story in the first place, the Rachel Deeb article I mentioned, was that it reminded me of science fiction, the way that everyone from the government who was talking to the mother and about the mother referred to her character, her maternal instincts, her levels of affection, her tenderness, as if love was something that could be measured. So I made that idea literal in the book, and I also wanted to call into question who's setting the standards. And one of the things that was scariest about that story, which provided a kernel of inspiration, was that it felt like the standards were always changing, and were also particular to that social worker and the judge. And the arbitrariness of the system felt especially terrifying when these were the stakes. And so I think in my book I made those stakes literal in terms of the way the school is constructed, but I actually I did speak to a lawyer, I think who was a guardian at Leonard, who did not want me to acknowledge him at all in the thank yous for the book or anything. I'm not just telling anyone that we spoke, but he was very, when I spoke to him, he was very critical, like, why do you think anyone's biased in the system? Like, what do you have against the family court system? And I think just that question, I think, told me a lot about the attitudes of the government, that anyone who works for the system has to believe they're doing the right thing in order to do this kind of work. And I think I wanted to call into question, like, how is it that those individuals have the power to destroy families?
Yeah, where the goalpost keeps moving, I mean, I think that that's extraordinarily accurate. One of the things, so at Juvenile Law Center, we don't do individual representation typically, but in the past we used to represent young people who were in the child welfare system as their child advocates. And one of the hardest things that I've ever done in my legal career was I represented one of my child advocate clients as a parent when her child was removed from her care. And she was a teenager, and her, you know, she was presumed to be a bad mother from the very beginning, and every single thing that she did that she was ordered to do by the court was never enough. I mean, it took over 3 years for her to get her child back, and it was such a heart-wrenching experience because watching this young person really do everything she's asked, every single thing that she's being told. and still being unable to actually be reunified with her child. It was just heartbreaking. And I think that the system, the way it imposes this notion of kind of best interests of children, like they're thinking that they're operating within the best interests of children, keeping them safe, and in this benevolent system. And it often is disregarding really what the child needs or wants. And so, one of the things that we have done in our work at Juvenile Law Center is really advocate for children to have representatives who are acting as their counsel, as their lawyers, not just there to say what they subjectively believe to be in the best interests of the child. And I know that that's something that is advocated for elsewhere, and that wasn't something that we saw with Frida's daughter, with Harriett. She wasn't able to articulate her own desires, and to the extent that she was asked, I think it was often imposed or inferred what really she needed or wanted. So I just wanted to put that out there, and if we can talk a little bit about kind of the protections that are sometimes in place and how we think about best interests of children and what we subjectively impose on them from the system.
Yes, it really has very little to do with what's actually in the best interest of children. First of all, the trauma of taking children away from their parents is given very, very little attention. Very little attention in family courts. It's assumed, as I said, especially with Black families, that the children are going to be better off away from their family, no matter what they're going into. So we haven't even started talking about, fortunately, Harriett was able to stay with her father and not be put into a foster system where she might have been with strangers, and with strangers who didn't take very good care of her. But many, many children are put into a system that's well documented to harm them. And how you could say that's in their best interest is absurd. But that's not the kinds of questions that are being asked in court. What's being asked in court is, did the mother comply, as you say, with every single part of the service plan, which may have nothing to do at all with what this family needs. That was another very accurate aspect of the School for Good Mothers, which is there is this cookie-cutter plan for how you can be a good mother, the training. And of course, that's a major part of what most mothers are, the service they're given is you must attend parent training classes. And that training may have absolutely nothing to do with why you were living in a homeless shelter, or why you didn't have adequate food in the house, or why you had to leave the house to apply for a job and leave your child at home, why your child has missed school. It has nothing to do with that, but that is what you're almost always told to do. And so the question, which could even be grounds for terminating parental rights, is did the mother fulfill every single mandate in the service plan? And when you were talking, Riya, about the client you had, it reminded me of another story I tell in Torn Apart, and also tell in Shattered Boxes. This mother, Jornell, was just so instrumental in my understanding how the system works. She was charged with medical neglect when she treated her baby, her very almost newborn baby, in a way that the doctors thought was wrong, which she thought she was following the doctor's advice. And instead of just telling her, no, this is not how you treat your baby's problems, they put him in foster care with a stranger. And then she had to go through drug treatment. No evidence, she had used drugs in the past, but no evidence the baby was affected by drugs or that she was using drugs. She had to go through drug treatment. Then she went through that. Well, you might relapse. So now you've got to go through a relapse program. And now you've got to go to psychological counseling for Munchausen syndrome because maybe you intended to harm your baby. And even when they said there's no evidence of that, well, but You have signs of depression, so you've got to go to another counselor. Then she got her own counselor, who she thought would be better, because she didn't like the ones that this was Chicago DCFS was giving her. And then they said, oh, you went to the wrong counselor. That shows that you're not compliant. Now you've got to start all over again. And every time she was evaluated, I'll just mention one other thing. In her files, one of the psychologists said that when she came into his office, the rug on the floor the corner was flipped up, and she flipped it down when she went into the office. And he wrote in her file, I saw this with my own eyes, this shows that she has an unrealistic view of what will impress me. And therefore, he came up with some psychological mental illness she had because she flipped down the carpet.
We thought about whether or not to call the police, and like we were just regularly puzzling over that question of what to do, and weighing whether or not the kids would be harmed more by being sent to foster care. And I mean, my husband had spoken to the kids, and they had been taken away from her and separated before, and they didn't want to be separated. And we knew that if we did get the police or child protective services involved, that might be introducing more harm. And I think it's something that was lurking in my subconscious, I think, when I was working, because it was just a regular question we had of like, what is the right thing to do? And I think I wanted to puzzle through that moral gray area and the question of who's making the standards. And I think what was, I'm straying a little off topic, but what was so remarkable in Dr. Roberts' books is giving people a sense of the scale of the problem. And I think in a lot of the conversations that I've had on my book, people are genuinely shocked that termination of parental rights is something that happens. And I think there is, I think there are two different realities that you talk about in your book between Black and brown communities and then white communities in terms of like, contact with police or child protective services. I remember when we were living in West Philly, there was one day where my 2-year-old escaped out the front door and got all the way down the block. And I ran to catch her, but I mean, if I had been a Black mother in a poor neighborhood where the police were there all the time, I could have gotten my child taken away. And
literally.
And so it's, I think I just have been surprised how little awareness there is about a lot of these issues that have been going on for so many decades in terms of the numbers involved.
Yeah, the only risk of people reading your book is that they think it's fiction. You know what I mean? It is fiction, but that they think this couldn't really happen, which is part of the reason I'm so happy we're having this conversation. It's so accurate about what actually does happen to hundreds of thousands of children and parents in this nation. Every year, 200,000 children are put in foster care, taken from their families and put in foster care. Half of Black children will experience a child welfare investigation before they reach age 18. So investigations are the norm for Black children in America. And I want to pick up on two things you said, Jess, and so let's see if I can remember. One is about the experience of communities, and the other is about your child running. So Riya mentioned Vanessa, who I begin the introduction with her story. Vanessa Peoples, a mother in Aurora, Colorado, who was at a family picnic, and her toddler strayed away when her cousin left the picnic. The toddler traipsed after her cousin into the parking lot. Now Vanessa could see this, but before she could get, because she had another child too, she had to grab the other child to go after the toddler, but before she could get to him, a passerby came by, grabbed her toddler, and immediately called the police. And then wouldn't give her child back until the police officer arrived. The police officer arrived, finally gave her child back, and gave her a ticket for misdemeanor child abuse. a criminal ticket for child abuse. And so that meant that caseworkers were going to come to her house. They did. I won't tell the whole story, but in the end, 7 police officers arrived at her house. They hog-tied her. They chained her arms behind her back and her ankles together and then chained them together, carried her upside down. She was like that for 30 minutes, and she had to plead guilty to reckless endangerment of a child in order to avoid going to prison. And then her life is now under the control of the state because she's in the child abuse registry. She can't get a job as a nurse because she's a child abuser, according to the laws of Colorado. And in the registry where landlords, employers, they all can find her there, deny her employment and housing. So it just has messed up her life and her children's life. She's economically insecure now, traumatized. Her children are traumatized. They saw all this, happen to her. So yes, it is actually the truth that in some neighborhoods, if your child runs out, and haven't we all had that? I mean, I can remember when my son, who was right next to me in the airport, I looked down, he's gone, toddler. And I'm desperately looking around the airport for him. I found him, but fortunately I was a little faster than him. But there's so many parents have this experience, but it makes a world of difference where it happens. And so just to say a little bit more about that experience of what the family policing system means if you're in an impoverished black neighborhood versus if you're in a middle-class or wealthy white neighborhood. I think it's absolutely true that most children in a wealthy white neighborhood have no clue what the child welfare system is. They have no clue. Go into any low-income or poor black neighborhood, I guarantee you that if not every child, virtually every child will know what, DCFS, ACS, whatever the term is. I did a study in Woodlawn, a black neighborhood in Chicago, about this because there weren't any studies about what is the impact on the whole neighborhood, everyone who lives in the neighborhood. And I found that all the people I interviewed said, oh, of course we know what DCF is. They called it the system. That was a major system in their lives. And when I said, how many people are in it? Oh my goodness. Everybody's in it. 90% of the people, a whole block of people are in it. And what does it do? Oh, they come and take your children. They all were so aware of the presence. And I think that is a major difference in the experience of black children and the government, and white children, especially if they're middle class or wealthy, and the government. For black children, government agents can come in at any moment and take you from your parents, and they're well aware of it. They've had a neighbor, a friend. If it hasn't happened to them, they've had a friend or a cousin or a neighbor or a classmate. It's absolutely the case where this has happened to them, and it's a real presence in their lives. And that is, when we talk about racial disparities in the system, those statistics don't really capture that. It's a major difference in what it means to be a black child in America and a white child in America.
It's something I've been thinking about a lot because living in Flatbush, I was one of the only Asian people around. It's a primarily West Indian neighborhood. That's the first time I lived in a neighborhood where there were cops on every other block. And it was a very different experience to live with that police presence, and such a stark difference from the mostly white neighborhood I live in now, where the police are never there, and where white children walk to school alone at age 7. And my daughter was asking, why can't she do that? I was trying to explain, they did that in the olden times. The parents would get in a lot of trouble, but yet these 7-year-olds walking to school are proving me wrong every day. But in a black neighborhood, those parents would have gotten their kids taken away. And so, one thing that struck me about the work is the idea that no parents can withstand this amount of scrutiny.
Yeah.
And it just really depends on if the government's watching.
Exactly. So I think people who read your book who aren't familiar and think that this doesn't really happen, So one of the great things I think about parent fiction and nonfiction, if someone reads your book, they're going to think this, and let's say it's a white middle class person, I can't imagine this happening to me, but I can't imagine how horrible it would be if it did happen to me. You know what I mean? And so I think it draws readers in to think, I would hate to live in a society like this. Now the next step is to read my book and say, oh, this actually happens to many people in certain neighborhoods. I wasn't aware of that, and hopefully the empathy and the concern that they had when they read your book goes over to the families that are at high risk of this happening to. And I think part of what's so important about advocacy and Juvenile Law Center's work is that we work to make, to take that empathy and put it on the families that are truly at risk of being torn apart. And that takes, it takes political advocacy, it takes reading fiction, it takes reading nonfiction, it takes programs like this, but it can happen that people's consciousness is raised and that they can become advocates, maybe even activists for ending this horrible system which does actually exist in the United States.
Can I ask a question to you? So, given that the problems are so pervasive and affect hundreds of thousands of families every year, why do you think there's so much more attention paid to the prison system as opposed to the family court system?
Well, part of it is I think I used the word propaganda from the beginning. I think people know that prisons are designed to punish people and they know they're horrible places to be. And most people would not want to be in prison. And there's been a movement to abolish prisons that's been around for a while, been a formal movement since the 1980s. And of course, other kinds of movements prior to that. Whereas with the family policing system, most Americans think it's a helpful, necessary, benevolent system that is supporting families and protecting children. And they have this rosy picture that hasn't been discredited enough by the media. And so there's just not enough to change their views. Now that's changing as a movement to abolish family policing grows, and you do see media paying more and more attention to this. We're seeing, just in the last 3 years, I've seen more on TV, news shows, and reporting about the harms of family policing than I saw in the past 20 years before that. And so that's changing. We're seeing news conferences around families where their children have been taken from them, and they hold a news conference and it gets reported. That used to never happen in the past. So I think people are becoming more and more aware of it, but part is just lack of awareness, but also this this view that it's necessary. And I think part of it also is a theme in your book, the gendered nature of it. It's both racism, but also this idea that mothers need to sacrifice everything for their children, and if their children are harmed, mothers are to be blamed. There's definitely this intersection of race, class, and gender, and disability in the system, and in a way that we don't see in the prison system. It's entangled more in the family policing system in a way that makes people afraid to challenge the system. They're afraid that if we don't have it, children are going to be harmed, not taking into account all the harm that happens to children because of the system the way it is now. Not only in the foster system and the trauma investigations and family separation, but also in the way it deters people from providing aid to families. So your story about being conflicted about what to do about the children who are being harmed in the apartment below you, that part of that is because the alternative that we have, the only option that we're told we have is call the child abuse hotline. And many people, including mandated reporters, realize that if I do that, I may be harming these children even more. Family members realize this. So are they going to go to and tell the doctor about the problems they're having? Are they going to tell the social worker, the teacher about the problems they're having? They're afraid to, because the system has turned professionals who have been trained to care for children, instead of doing that, to call a harmful system to come in. And the professionals feel they're bind too. I've talked to many, many doctors, especially because some of my work is with doctors and addressing racism in medicine, and I've given lots of talks to doctors. I'll tell you, once I started adding in something about family policing, that's the first question. I don't want to have to call the child abuse hotline when I suspect that a child may be neglected or maltreated in some way, but I'm told I have to do it. How can I get out of it? And so I think parents are afraid to get help, and the people who could be providing help are not providing it. Instead, they're calling a harmful system. And I think that is a barrier to figuring out better ways. And what would have been a better way to help the children in that apartment? What would be a better way to help children who have inadequate housing or clothing or food? Instead of figuring that out, which we could do, we rely on this harmful system.
Well, and often, in order to even get that support, often people think that they have to engage the system.
Yes.
And the system is not designed to come in and provide those supportive services alone, because of the constant surveillance. And I think that the point you made about mandated reporters, many people do feel that, and many people don't understand what making that call actually means.
Well, that's true too.
And they're approaching it with their own biases, and so a doctor or somebody else who is in that role is going to use their own judgments about whether or not this person is a good mother or is doing things as they would do or otherwise, and so will make these calls based upon their own subjective opinions, not really knowing the door that it's now open.
Yes, that's very true. So if you're told you should report your suspicions, based on what standard? Based on what evidence? I say mandated reporting is an invitation to discriminate.
Absolutely.
And we know that doctors and teachers and others, they make their decisions based on racist stereotypes. That's been well documented. And so it's an invitation to discriminate and to apply whatever subjective, as you said, judgment that they have. It's so obvious if you tell people, report your suspicions, that's going to be based on their individual subjective judgments, which are biased. That's just should be a given. And that's absolutely true. And also, it's also true that many people don't know what is going to happen to that child. There are people who really believe, if I call the hotline, I will get housing for the family. I will get clothing for the children. I will improve their health care and education. And they may be surprised to find out that the child now has been traumatically taken from their family. The family hasn't been given housing. And the parents are now in parent training classes while the child is living with strangers in the foster system.
So I want to give us a moment to get some questions from the audience. Janine, you had your hand up.
Well, on that,
There's a microphone coming.
I was just going to ask the alternative, right? So, downstairs that are being beat, and we know this is not the answer. What else?
I'm glad you asked that question because I wouldn't want to leave this as we should just get rid of this family policing system. That's what a lot of people are afraid of. Okay, now what's going to happen to all the children who are being harmed or whose needs aren't met? And abolition, which I support, and JLC supports, isn't about abandoning children. It's about figuring out better ways than we have now to provide for children's needs. So first I should point out that the vast majority of children who are taken from their families and put in the foster system are taken on grounds of neglect, not physical or sexual abuse. Upwards of 70%, according to federal statistics, are there because of neglect. Neglect is basically defined as poverty. It's a failure to meet some material need, whether it's clothing or housing or food, education, health care, failure to meet that. And most parents who fail to meet the needs of their children, it's because they can't afford it or they don't have the resources available. They're not deliberately withholding these things. You know, there are rare examples of that, but that's what you read about in the news, but that is an extreme minority of cases. So I think it's important to recognize that. But even in the case of children who are being physically harmed, all right, why? What is the situation in the family? You said there were 8 children there? 6 children, 8 family members. You know, it's stressful to take care of 6 children. Do they have adequate respite? You know, when children go into the foster system, in some jurisdictions, the state will pay for respite care for the foster caregivers. Okay, maybe there's a stressful situation and that could be addressed, and we know that a lot of physical abuse, you know, where parents they believe they're disciplining their children or keeping their children safe, the physical corporal punishment, which I'm guessing is probably what was going on there, is because of stresses in the family. So if we relieve those stresses, it's very likely the abuse would go away. Very likely. Not all the time, but that's one thing that, in general, we can support families better through policies of giving them more income, providing housing, providing care, all of that. Okay, that would help. All right, there's still going to be some where that's not going to do it. Well, let's have communities where people feel they can address their neighbors in a way to help them deal with whatever's going on. You know, it's hard to imagine that now because we're told, call the child abuse hotline if you see something. But there are people developing transformative justice approaches that hold people accountable for harm, whether we're talking about sexual assaults, intimate partner violence, or harms to children, that are working, but we don't invest in that. We invest in calling the police, we invest in calling the child abuse hotline, and we haven't really explored these other ways of dealing with violence in homes. That there's a lot of evidence that the way we deal with it now doesn't work. It doesn't work. We just haven't in the United States really addressed the problem of intimate partner violence or violence against children. And the carceral approaches we use do not work. In fact, they may make it worse. In some cases, they make the violence worse when police are called or when people are put in jail. And so let's stop relying on what we know doesn't work, what we know is harmful, what we know deters people from getting involved with their neighbors and helping out, and really radically change to community-based approaches to providing the supports that families need. That would work much better. I truly believe that just all the money we spend on keeping children away from their families, if we gave it to families, the neediest, the most impoverished families, we would do far better at protecting children and keeping children safe than we're doing now. That's just one step. That's just one step.
Two more questions, right? One right there.
Oh, hi. So my name is Rahul Mehta. I teach in the Interior Writing Department. I wanted to thank you all so much for the work that you do and for bringing that work here to our space. Thank you so very much. I think I just wanted to say something about, since we're talking about systems and some sort of racial disparities that are baked into these systems, I guess I just wanted to say something about the systemic way that Native American and Indigenous children have been taken from their families and given, in many cases, to white Christian families to raise, from the decades-long history of that happening. And I think the other thing that I wanted to talk about, maybe ask about, is, I think there's been an increasing sort of policing of parents of trans children. And I don't know, I would be interested to hear anything you might want to say about that.
Do you want to?
Whenever I've been asked about this, I generally have said there's no dystopian novel that's as dystopian as America today. There's really nothing that you could invent in fiction that will reflect accurately all the horrors going on right now. It's really terrifying. I mean, parents in Florida and Texas are being held to a totally different set of standards, and it's like something out of 1934 that they could support their children and then be punished for that.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised both of those groups that have been targeted by the family policing system, and it's not an accident that the two groups in America that are most likely to have their children taken from them, most likely to have parental rights terminated, are Native or Indigenous people and Black people. And we can look at the history of the child welfare system targeting those groups throughout US history, but especially in the 19th century, turning to child removal as a way of re-enslaving Black children, and the US government using it as a military weapon against Native tribes. It was official military policy to take Native children from their homes and put them in military camps, in church schools, what became then the boarding school network with hundreds of schools, so-called boarding schools. And this is typical of the system. They have these euphemisms. If you look at any of these horrible residential treatment facilities, in Philadelphia it was Wordsworth Academy, Lakeside Academy, where a teenager was killed by staff. And similarly, the boarding schools were actually institutions where Native children were stripped of their culture, forced to work. They were hired out to families to work for them, physically and sexually abused, tortured, just horrific experiences. Many died and were buried in mass graves, which are now being discovered, a whole set of them discovered in Canada, and they're beginning to be discovered in the United States as well. And so I think that history is so important to recognize that child removal and family separation has been used for centuries as a tool against marginalized groups, a tool of oppression. So that's important. And then shouldn't be surprising that when states like Texas and Florida want to target the families of trans children, they bring out the family policing system. And that's what Governor Greg Abbott did in Texas. He directed caseworkers to start investigating parents of trans children on grounds that they were medically neglecting them. And we've seen, as Jasmine said, families moving out of the state in fear that their children will be taken from them. And that should give you a clue about the system, that it is not a benevolent system. Children are weaponized against their families as a way of oppressing marginalized groups. Tell me if I'm wrong. That is what the child welfare system has been used to do from its very inception.
I think we have one question up here and one in the back, and probably just time for those two.
Hi, my name is Claudia Kim. I am an assistant defender at the Defender Association of Philadelphia. I am currently working in the Juvenile Division of Family Court, and it is depressing. It is terrible. And I see what you're probably the end product of family policing.
Yeah.
And so thank you both so much. I came here for inspiration because, again, just Jessamine Chan. The reception to your novel, I was heartened to hear that people were like, oh my goodness, but how do we get more stories out there that tell about the children and how they're affected by government action? Or can I start writing short stories and knitting them and having people read them so they know what's happening? I would love to hear more about how I think your novel or any storytelling that we could do, fictional or not, can help spread the word. And similar to Dr. Roberts, what can we do? Because other than every day going to 1501 Arch and wanting to burn the building down, I'd love to hear more ideas.
I think until I published my novel, I didn't realize how few novels have been written about this subject. It feels like there are a fair number of novels that tackle the prison system, but not as many that tackle family policing. So my personal project, as I've done a paperback toward the spring, was to always mention Torn Apart.
Well, I've been promoting your book too.
It felt like it's harder, I think, for the average person who doesn't work in the system to know what to do. So I guess it felt like the thing that I could do is encourage people to learn more by reading your book and learn more about the real life parallels. And I think with art, it's kind of like you have to play the long game, because I mean the people who are in charge and who are going to be setting the rules are not that likely to read our books. So it's just in an ideal world, you would want lawmakers to read. I would love for people in charge of the system to read my novel, read The Nickel Boys, or read Chain Gang All Stars, and build empathy for the people who the system is impacting. But I think when you're with novels, I think you have to think about like what the impact will be years from now in terms of the work being in the world, because the immediate effects are not necessarily tangible. But I do hope more people will want to learn more. And I have been surprised, like we talked about this, that I generally get questions about motherhood culture rather than the parallels with the family policing system. Whereas I thought I was really making my points like too obvious in my book about like the critique of the family policing system, but I think it's that there's not as much general awareness as I thought there would be about the system at all.
Yeah, I think people think it's science fiction. And again, that's why it's so good to be able to pair us together to say what you are alarmed at as science fiction actually is happening in the lives of real life people today. I just have a couple comments. Do we have time?
Yeah, we have one of our youth advocates in the back has a question too.
Okay, that was one of my comments.
Okay.
One of my comments was that Juvenile Law Center has a terrific group of youth advocates who are telling their stories, and that is I'm going to leave it at that, because that was what I was going to say.
Thank you so much, guys. Honestly, the things that we've been through can only be amplified by the advocacy that you guys do. So all the applause is definitely returned back. My question was, as somebody who has lived experience and oftentimes has to go go to events and talk about some of the most detrimental aspects of my life, right? And kind of do that trauma exhibition that comes with advocacy. When you find yourself kind of depicting those situations, what are some of the ways that you keep yourself grounded in hope and kind of create hopeful characters in distressing situations? And how do you find that balance of, showing these situations while at the same time keeping that humanity that, that the reader is going to resonate with?
So the question is how to stay grounded and hopeful even when writing about distressing, serious subjects. Am I paraphrasing that correctly? So the crazy thing was I wrote my quite grim book while parenting my tiny child. So my days were spent researching the family court system, and then the afternoons were spent chasing my toddler around. And so I think thinking about these issues while in the throes of early parenthood, I think it almost made me more appreciative of the life I had, because I knew I knew what I might be taking for granted. The fact that I was able to make my mistakes in private, the fact that I could just go down the street, and if my toddler was rolling around and having a tantrum, no one was going to call the police on me. And so I think I was very aware of all the class privileges I had, all the racial privileges I had, and so I think the fact that I was thinking about loss all the time just made me more grateful for the time that we had, that I didn't have to worry that we were going to have a year apart or 2 years apart, and it was definitely a crazy thing to do, while parenting, to be going to that dark place and wondering what it would be like to have a child taken away. But I think to stay grounded in hope is, you kind of have to make art, because otherwise you have to believe there's some greater purpose to it in order to keep going, because otherwise it feels like an impossible task.
Yeah, I would say the same thing about being an activist, that especially an abolitionist. It's all based on hope, on a vision of a better world that you and other people you're working with are moving toward. And so for me, it's working with people who have a common mission, a common vision, a common set of values about a more humane and caring world. And, everything isn't horrible. There are victories that, not a lot, but we do have victories here and there, and you celebrate them together, and that makes you even more hopeful and happy. I'll just mention something. I always say that I never give a talk on this topic without mentioning Joyce McMillan. I don't know what it is, but Joyce McMillan is an abolitionist activist in New York City whose daughters were removed from her based on a positive drug test. And she finally got them back after a couple of years, and then founded an organization, JMAC for Families. And I love working with Joyce. So Joyce says it like it is, but she also has a kind of joy about her. We laugh a lot. But just recently, I'm blanking on which paper it was. Maybe somebody in the room saw it. But her daughter wrote an op-ed piece in a major paper, like the Washington Post or something like that. I don't remember which one it was. And about her experiences while she was in foster care and against the family policing system. And there was a photo of the two of them, Kayla and Joyce together. And it just made me so happy that, that they tried to ruin her family, and Joyce fought against it along with her family defender. And they had this victory in the end of the daughter having this major op-ed piece, in the newspaper. And something like that gives you hope. The hope now we have a new generation like you and the other youth advocates who are taking up the mantle and fighting for a more just and humane world too. And so, on the one hand, there are these horrible ways in which the system just shuttles people who are put in foster care into juvenile delinquency, as the lawyer mentioned. The way in which in Ria's case where you have, I bet you your client was in foster care, and then when she has a baby, they put the baby in foster care. You know, these transgenerational harms that are so depressing, where it looks like it's just generation after generation caught up in this system. But then you also have stories of people who come out of it, who survive it, not only survive but thrive, and take up the fight to move forward toward a vision of a better world. And I think that gives me hope. I think that's something that we can celebrate and remain joyful about, even in the midst of this super depressing time, scary, frightening time. But I think we have to, as Jasmine said, you have to be hopeful. You have to be.
I think that's a great place to end. So I want to say thank you so much to both of you for being here. We did not get to the robot babies and the digital surveillance of the family police.
But it happens. It happens.
So I would really encourage you, if you didn't get your copy of the book, please go and check in and get your copy. Read both of them and read them in tandem with one another. I think that's how we intended this conversation to really be. Thank you again to University of Arts, to Stephen. Thank you so much to Harriett. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to our Juvenile Law Center staff for all the behind the scenes work. Thank you to all of you for your great questions, for being here today. I did not do an introduction really of Juvenile Law Center, but I want to share a little bit. Our work is designed to ensure that young people in the family policing system and in the juvenile and criminal legal system are met with fairness and dignity and equity and opportunity, and our work is really designed to ensure that we are working toward abolishing these very harmful systems. So if you'd like to learn more about our work, you can visit our website, jlc.org, or there's QR codes around the room, and you can scan that on your phone, and we'd love for you to also support our work. So thank you so much for being here, and have a wonderful night.
Thank you.